Hey folks, in this episode I'm going to show you how to make this animation loop in geometry nodes. It's a seamless loop, it's relatively easy to make, so without further ado, let's get to it. So open up Blender, so the first thing I'll do is I'll navigate to the top left where it says edit, we go to preferences and we go to add-ons and search for node, for Node Wrangler, and if it's not enabled, enable the Node Wrangler here, and then click this button, click Save Preferences, and that will ensure that the Node Wrangler loads every time when you load Blender. I'll then close that window, I'll navigate to the right and go to my Output tab over here. I'm going to select Render Region and ensure that you set a frame rate of 30 frames per second. I'm also in my Layout tab at the top here. You might not have your timeline open, so I'll show you how to do that. So I'll take my cursor to the bottom left until I see a crosshair. I'll left click and drag and I'll collapse that window. So to open up your timeline, take your cursor to the top left until you see a crosshair, left click and drag up, and that will open up a new window. Then change it from 3D viewport to timeline. And on my timeline, I'm going to hit N and that will close the N panel. And I'm going to go to my end frame and I'm going to set this to 120. So we've only got 120 frames in our scene. I'll just increase this window here. Maybe I'll collapse that over there just so we can see what's in our timeline. Excellent. I'm going to open up my geometry node editor now. So I'll take my cursor to the bottom left until I see a crosshair. I'll left click and drag and open up a new window, and we'll change this from 3D viewport to geometry node editor. And now in my outliner for the cube object, I'm just going to rename this to GeoNode Loop. I'll hit enter. I'm going to go over to my material tab over here, and for the material I'm going to rename this to GeoNode Loop. And on your geometry node editor with your default cube selected, I'm going to click new and we'll rename this to GeoNode Loop. And in my geometry node window, I'm going to hit N, hide the N panel, and maybe I'll increase the geometry nodes window just so we can see what we're doing. So in your geometry nodes window, I'm going to select the group input. I'm going to hit G, just bring this across over to here. I'll then hit Shift A, I'm going to go to Mesh, we'll choose Primitives and we'll choose Grid. I'll pop that there. I'll then connect the mesh socket to the geometry socket of the group output. I'm going to set the size on the X and Y to 2 meters, and I'm going to change the vertices for the X and Y to 512. We're going to displace the vertices on this mesh with a wave texture, and in order to do that we need a set position node. So I'm going to hit Shift A, I'm going to go to geometry, right, and we choose set position, and I'll pop that in between the grid node and the group output node. I'll then hit Shift A, I'm going to go to texture and we'll choose wave texture, and if we plug the color straight into the position, it's going to go a bit wacky, you can't see anything. So I'm going to hit Shift A, I'm going to go to utilities, we go to vector and we choose vector math. I'm going to keep this set to add, and I'm going to pop that in between the wave texture node and the set position node. We'll switch the noodle from the top socket into the bottom socket. I'll then hit Shift A, I'm going to go to geometry, read, and we'll select position, and I'll plug the position socket into the top socket of the vector add node. So as you can see, it's gone a bit whack, but we're going to normalize this. Currently, it's displacing the mesh on X, Y, and Z coordinates, and we only want to displace it on the Z coordinate. So I'll hit Shift A, I'm going to go to Utilities, we go to Vector, and we'll choose Combine X, Y, Z, and I'll pop that in between the Wave Texture node and the Vector Math node, and we'll swap the X to Z. So now it's only displaced on the Z axis. Excellent. I'll then hit Shift A, I'm going to go to Utilities, Vector, and we choose Vector Math, and I'll pop that in between the Combine X, Y, Z and the other vector math node, and I'll change this from add to subtract, and we want to subtract it on the z-axis by 0.5. So now it should be center to the origin. Excellent. Hit Shift D and we'll duplicate that vector math, and I'll pop it in between these two vector math nodes. I'll change it from subtract to scale, and I'm going to scale it by 0.5. I'll just move this position node over to here. I'm going to set the scale to 0.5. I'm going to set the distortion to 50. I'm going to set the detail to 4. I'm going to change the detail scale to 2. I'm going to keep the detail roughness to 0.5. Just see what we've got. Okay, excellent. I want to be able to stylize and shape this pattern. So I'm going to take this wave texture node. I'm going to hit G. Just going to drag this across over to here. I hit Shift A. I'm going to go to Utilities, Color, and we'll choose RGB Curves. And I'll pop that in between the wave texture node and the Combine XYZ node. Left click on this line to add a control point, and I'll drag it over to round about there. I'll then left click again and I'm going to add another control point over to here. I'll then left click and add another control point, and I'll bring this up to round about there. Now you can see what it's doing to our pattern up here. So I'm going to position mine to round about there, maybe down slightly. Actually, I'll bring it up. Just going to tweak these, kind of like an S curve. Now I want to shade this smooth, so I hit Shift A, I'm going to go to Mesh, we go to Right, and we choose Set Shade Smooth, and I'll pop that in between the set position and the group output. We also want to bring in the GeoNodes loop material, so I hit Shift A, we go to Material, and we choose Set Material, and I'll pop that in between the Set Shade Smooth and the group output. I then click in this box here, and I'm going to choose the GeoNodes loop material. In fact, on the Material tab over here, I'm just going to darken this down just so we can see it better in the viewport. So currently, in the viewport, our mesh is set to 512 vertices on the X and Y, but when I hit render, I want to be able to add a subdivision surface, but only upon render, and that will ensure that the viewport performance is optimized. In order to do that, I'm going to hit Shift A, I'm going to go to Utilities, and I'll choose Switch, and I'll pop that in between the grid node and the set position node. I'll then take the mesh socket from the grid node and plug it into the bottom socket of the switch node. I'll then hit Shift A, I'm going to go to Input, Scene, and we'll choose Is Viewport. And I'll plug the Is Viewport socket into the switch socket on the switch node. Shift A, we go to Mesh, go Operations, and we choose Subdivision Surface. And I'll pop that in between the grid node and the false socket of the switch node. Let's just drag these about a bit just to neaten this up so we can see where everything's going. And on the Subdivision Surface node, I'm going to set the levels to 2. So what this does is when it's in the viewport, so Is Viewport, which is true, that will display the grid with 512 vertices. But when we hit render, because it won't be viewport, it will add 2 levels of a subdivision surface. Plus, what we're going to do is I'm going to go over to the spanner icon over here for my modifiers tab. I'm going to click Add Modifier. I'm going to go to Generate, and I'll choose Subdivision Surface. I'm going to mute that from the viewport. I'll then reselect my Geometry Nodes modifier, just so we can see what we're doing. Okay, this is looking good so far. Now, I want to store the Z value for this wave texture, which we can then bring into the shader editor and use as a mask. So let's do that now. So I'll just take my cursor to the top left of the Geometry Nodes editor until I see a crosshair. I'm going to left click and I'll drag across like this, and that will open up a new window. I'll then change it from Geometry Nodes Editor to Shader Editor. In the Geometry Node Editor window, I'm going to hit Shift A, I'm going to go to Attribute, and we choose Store Named Attribute, and I'll pop that in between the Set Shade Smooth and the Set Material. I'll then hit Shift A, I'm going to go to Utilities, Vector, and we'll choose Separate XYZ. I'm going to drag the vector from this Add node into the vector of the Separate XYZ. I'll just bring this over to here. And the attribute we want to capture will be this Z value, and we'll give that attribute a name. So I'm going to type in Z pos for Z position. You can name it to anything you like. The only thing is you have to remember the name exactly as it's spelt here. So now in my shader editor window, I'm going to hit Shift A, I'm going to go to Input, and I'll choose Attribute. I'll then type in Z pos for Z position. Alternatively, you can just hover your cursor over the name and hit Ctrl C to copy, and then hover your cursor over here and then hit Ctrl V to paste. I'll just drag my attribute node over here, and I'm going to plug the factor from the attribute node into the base color of the principal BSDF. As you can see, it's added this mask. Let me just increase my shader editor a minute. I'll then hit Shift A, I'm going to go to Converter, and I'm going to choose Color Ramp. And I'll pop that in between the factor of the attribute node and the base color of the principal BSDF. I'm going to change the interpolation type from linear to ease. Now you can see it's a bit pixelated here, and the reason for that is because the attribute that we stored is based on the mesh density, but we can smooth this out. So I'll hit Shift A, I'm going to go to Attribute, and we can choose Blur Attribute, and I'll pop that in between the Separate XYZ and the Store Named Attribute, and as you can see it's smoothing out the mask. So maybe I'll turn the iterations up to, let's say 3, maybe 4, and that will give us a smoother transition. So we're finished with the geometry nodes. I'm just going to hit Control Spacebar just so you can have a quick preview. So I'm going to decrease this window over here, but in my geometry nodes window, I'm just going to bring this across over to here, and I'll zoom into the wave texture over here. We're going to need to copy these values and paste them in a wave texture over here in a minute, but before we do that, let's just go to this color ramp and give this thing some color. So for this first flag, I'm going to set to like a blue color. Maybe I'll go to RGB and I'll give it 100% blue, and I'll turn down red and green to 0. I'll click the plus button and we'll add another flag. I'll bring this across over to, let's say, around about there, and I'm going to give this like a light blue, maybe something around there. I'll click this flag, I'm going to click the plus button one more time, I'll select this middle flag, and I'm going to change this to black. Maybe I'll change the position to, let's say, maybe I'll change the position to 0.15. I'll then select this last flag, and we're going to change this to like a gold color, maybe something around about there. We can change these colors a bit later on, and I'll drag this flag all the way across over to, let's say, around about there. Maybe I'll bring this black flag across, and I'll bring this across. We'll just shimmy these over till we got something that we like. Maybe something around there. Okay, excellent. So I'm going to drag this color ramp up. I hit Shift A. I'm going to go to converter, and I'm going to choose color ramp, and I'll pop that down there. I'll then connect the factor from the attribute node into the factor of the color ramp. I'm going to change the interpolation type from linear to ease. I'm going to drag this white flag all the way over to, let's say, 0.25, and I'll drag this black flag all the way across to round about there, maybe, let's say, 0.175. I'm going to select the white flag, and I'll select the color swatch, ensure that the RGB is set to 1, or on HSV that the value is set to 1. I'll then plug this into the metallic socket of the principal BSDF. Maybe I'll take the roughness down slightly. We can adjust these values until we've got something quite precise, maybe something around there. It's just I want all the yellow to be metallic. Okay, so with this color ramp selected, I'm going to hit Control Shift D, and that will duplicate the color ramp whilst maintaining the connection to the previous node, and I'll pop that down there. I'll then plug the color from this color ramp into the roughness socket, the principal BSDF. White is 100% rough and black is 0 roughness. I want to invert this, so I'm going to hit Shift A, I'm going to go to color, and I'm going to choose invert color, and I'll pop that in between the bottom color ramp and the roughness socket, the principal BSDF. Now I don't want it to be 100% shiny, so I'm going to take this white value, which is now inverted into black, and I'm going to reduce the value to, let's say, 0.9. So it's not 100% shiny, there's a slight bit of roughness, and that will help improve the reflections from the lights that we place into the scene. I want to give this material a bit more detail, so I'm going to hit Shift A, I'm going to go to texture, and I'll choose wave texture, and we're going to copy all these values over here. So for the scale, I'm going to set to 0.5, distortion, I'm going to set to 50, the detail, I'm going to set to 4, the detail scale, we'll set to 2, the roughness, we'll keep it 0.5, and the phase offset, we'll deal with that in a minute. I'll then hit Shift A, I'm going to go to vector, and I'm going to choose bump node. Let's just drag this up here, and I'll drag this up to here. I'll now plug the factor from this wave texture into the height of the bump node, and the normal socket from the bump node into the normal socket of the principal BSDF. As you can see, we're getting quite a lot of bump here. We can reduce the strength way too much, so I might just take this up to, let's say, 0.25. That should do. Now, in the shader editor on this wave texture, I'm going to set the detail of this wave texture to 8. That will just give us a lot more detail on the bump. Maybe I'll set the strength to 0.333. I'm just going to increase the geometry nodes editor window over here. So now we want to be able to animate this so it loops. So just for now, on my grid node, I'm going to turn the vertices on X and Y to 256 vertices, just so it will play better in the viewport. And on your wave texture node for the phase offset, I'm going to type in hash frame divide by 19 and then hit enter, and that's added a driver. This should be a seamless loop now, so I'm going to hit numpad 7 to go into top view. I'm just going to hit play just to make sure that everything's set up correctly. Excellent. I'll just skip back to frame 1. I'm going to increase my shader editor window, and for the wave texture in the shader editor window for the phase offset, I'm going to type in hash frame divide by 19, hit enter, and now that's added the same driver. Alternatively, you can right click this and you click copy driver, and then you right click in your phase offset and click paste driver. So in my geometry nodes editor, I'm just going to scroll over and zoom in to my grid node, and I'm going to change the vertices back to 512 vertices on X and Y. I'll then take my cursor to the top right hand side of my shader editor window until I see a crosshair. I'll left click and drag, and we'll collapse the geometry nodes window, and now we've just got the shader editor window open, which should be reflected over here. Excellent. I'll just decrease this window. I'm going to hit numpad 7 to go into top view, numpad period to center the view. I'll then hit Control Alt numpad 0, and that will center our camera to the view. I'm going to go to my outliner and select my camera. Under your object data tab over here, make sure that X and Y location is set to 0. I'm going to set the Z location to 5. I'll then select the camera data tab down here. I'll set the focal length to 120mm. The reason my focal length is so high is because I want a high depth of field. So I'm going to enable depth of field here. I'll just expand these depth of field options over here. I'll then hit numpad 1 to go into front view. I'm going to hit Shift A. I'm going to go to empty, and we'll choose sphere. I'll then zoom in. I'll hit G, Z, hold down Control to snap it to the grid, and just ensure that this sphere intersects with the top of the mesh, right about there. And in my outliner, I'm going to rename this empty to pull focus. I'll click enter. I'll then select my camera, and under depth of field for the focus on object, I'm going to select that object, which is pull focus. I'm going to set my blades to 16, and I'm going to change the f-stop to, let's say, 0.7. Let's see what that looks like. I'll then hit numpad 0 to go into camera view. If I disable and re-enable depth of field, you can kind of see what it's doing. Before we continue, I'm going to go to File, Save As, and I'm going to save my file as like and subscribe. Thanks folks, you absolute legends. I'll then click Save As. Let's get on with lighting this scene. In my outliner, I'm going to select my point light and I'm going to delete that. I'll then go to the World tab over here and I'm going to turn the strength all the way down to 0. I'm going to go to my Render tab over here. I'll change it from Eevee to Cycles, and for the noise threshold under Render, I'm going to set mine to 0.025, and for the max samples, I'm going to type in 128. That should be more than enough for this scene. Scroll down until it says Light Paths. I'll expand those options. I'm going to decrease the bounces on Diffuse and Glossy to 3, and I'll disable Reflective and Refractive Caustics. I'll then hit numpad 1 to go into front view. I'm going to hit Shift A, I'm going to go to light and I'm going to choose point light. I'll hit G, Z, hold down control, snap it to the grid to around about there. I'll just go to my object data, so it's 1 meter high. I'm going to hit numpad 7. I'm just going to zoom out a bit. I hit G, Y, hold down control, snap it to the grid to around about there. So on the Y axis it's set to 2 meters and the Z axis it's set to 1 meter. I'll then hit numpad 0 to go into camera view. I'll then navigate to my light data tab over here. I'll go to render. I'm going to set the strength to, let's say, 1000 watts, and I'm going to change the radius to 2 meters. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, maybe I'll go to my object tab over here, and I'll increase the height for my lamp on the Z-axis to 2 meters. I'll then go back to my light data over here. Okay, excellent. I'm going to go back to viewport shading. I'm going to hit numpad 1 to go into front view. I'm going to hit Shift A. I'm going to go to light, and I'm going to choose sun. I'll then hit G, Z, hold down control, snap it to the grid, and I'm going to take it up to there. The position of the sun lamp doesn't matter. What matters is the direction of which it's pointing. At the moment, it's pointing directly down. We're going to adjust that and we're going to rotate it on the x-axis. So I'm going to hit numpad 0 to go into camera view. And in my outliner, in the top right, I'm going to mute my point light. I'm going to go back into rendered view. I'm going to select my sun. I'll go to my lamp data over here. And for the angle, I'm going to set this to 75 degrees. I'm going to go to my object data over here. And I'm going to rotate it on the x-axis to, let's say, 30 degrees. Okay, excellent. I'll just re-enable my point light. I'm just going to go into viewport shading. I'm going to hit F12 just to render out a preview. Okay, I've just cancelled that render because I'm seeing too much black on the gold reflections here and I don't like that at all. So I'm going to adjust my lighting. So I'm going to close this window. I'm going to go into my viewport shading render mode. I'll select my sun lamp and I'll decrease the X rotation to, let's say, 20 degrees. I then go to my light data and I'm going to increase the angle to, let's say, 90 degrees. I'm also going to set my point light in my outliner. I'm going to change the radius from 2 meters to 3 meters. I'll also navigate out of my camera view. I'm going to select my displacement mesh down here. I'm going to increase this window. I'll change it from the shader editor and go into geometry node editor. I'm going to zoom in to this vector math node here where it says scale, and I'm going to take the scale down to, let's say, 0.4. I hit enter. Okay, I'm going to hit numpad 1 to go into front view. I'll then go into viewport shading. I'm going to select this pull focus empty object here. I'm going to zoom in, I'm going to hit G, Z, hold down control, snap it to the grid, and I'll bring it down to round about there. I'll then hit numpad 0 to go into camera view. I'm going to go into rendered view. Okay, we're still getting quite a bit of black here. Maybe if I select my displacement mesh again, I'll change it from the geometry node editor and go into shader editor. I'm going to zoom out and I'm going to decrease my bump strength to 0.25. Okay, that's looking a bit better. Excellent. If you find that this is rendering a bit slow, you can always go to your modifier tab over here and decrease the subdivision surface on your render down to 1. Alternatively, you can go to your geometry node editor and you can decrease the cuts on your subdivision surface on here to level 1. It is best to reduce the subdivision surface on your modifier stack to level 1 rather than this one, but opposed to that, I'm just going to hit F12 and render out another preview. Okay, I've just cancelled that render because we're still getting a lot of black on our gold and I don't like that. So I'm just going to hit escape and we'll close that window. I'm going to go into rendered view. I'll increase this window. I'm going to change it from my geometry node editor and go into shader editor. I'm going to increase the strength on my bump node back to 0.333, but this time for the roughness on this bottom color ramp here, I'm just going to select the white flag. I'll select that swatch and I'm going to drop the value to, let's say, 0.8, maybe 0.75. There we go, that's reduced the black spots. Excellent. I think I'm going to go back to my geometry node editor window, and for the blur attribute, I'm going to set the iterations to 3. That should help speed up rendering. I would encourage you to change, modify, adapt and customize this setup. So, you know, you can change your RGB curves, you can change the wave texture in your geometry node window. If you make any changes to the wave texture in the geometry window, I would advise when you go back to your shader editor to make the same changes. The only thing that can be different will be the detail. I'm going to hit Control S and that will save the file. I'll then go to my output tab over here. I'll expand the output options, and for your output, this is where you save your image sequence. So I'm going to choose the file location where I'm going to save my image sequence. I'll then click accept. So if you're happy with your final result, you can set your file format to PNG, which is a lossless file format. I'm going to set mine to OpenEXR with a codec of DWAA lossy, and that will decrease my file size whilst increasing the dynamic range. So when I bring it into DaVinci Resolve, I'll have more flexibility when it comes to color grading. I'll then navigate back to my render tab over here, and I'll hit Control F12. And that will render out my image sequence. I'm going to upload the project files onto my Patreon, so if you join as a free member, you'll have access to this file alongside loads of other Blender files that I've made in previous tutorials. That's the tutorial in a nutshell. I hope you found this useful. If you did, please click like and subscribe. It really helps my channel. Have a great day, level up, and thanks for watching.